We are welcome to our live stream that happens every Tuesday. I Let's just give a few more seconds for people to join in on all of our streams, and let's make sure that we are live everywhere. So I'll give a few more seconds. In the meanwhile, you can go to slido.com, enter the code, or scan the QR code to ask any question, answer polls. We'll have polls within the session as well. So feel free to ask any question, to answer anything. And yeah, so let's just wait 5 more seconds or so. Okay. We're still waiting to go live on LinkedIn, but okay, should be all good now. All right, cool. Then, so today we have Somnath with us, who has 23 years of experience in the software industry, working with GSIs, enterprises, and startups in the telecom, financial services, healthcare, e-commerce, and job tech domains. He's been a successful enterprise sales leader, held senior general management roles for the last 9 years, and for the last 9 years, he has been in the product leadership roles. He has built core ML and NLP products from the trenches of for the likes of NatWest, Amazon, and his own startup, and very recently, at Total Jobs. I will speak a little bit about myself, very little, not to bore you with too much details about myself, but I am a product management consultant. I have 7 years of experience in product management, ranging from B to B2C. Most of my experience is in B2C, but some of it is also in B2B. All right. Sorry. What do we do at Product People? So this is a little bit about Product People. So our mission is to help companies discover and deliver greater products faster. We do interim product management. We empower our product management community to share knowledge generously while managing the hands-on work of a product manager, owner, and product ops, or product leaders on fractional basis. We onboard fast, line teams, and deliver greater outcomes. Thanks to our in-house team. We also curate free events like this one for the biggest PM communities in Europe, and that has over 60,000 members now. All right. We want to get to know you a little bit. So we do have a poll, and you can answer via Slido. The question here is, where do you think most AI projects fail? Wrong problem selection, weak product strategy, poor data quality, over engineering too early. We'll give it a few more seconds or a minute to see some of the answers, and then we continue. And if you haven't yet opened Slido, you can go to slido.com, enter the code, or you can scan the QR code via your phone and take it from there.
It's interesting. I'm going to just jump the gun. It's interesting because this is one of the aspects that I'm going to cover anyways in the session that will follow. But it'll be interesting to see what people think are the usual issues.
Okay, we have a few answers, and we have for now it is wrong problem selection. Let's wait a few more seconds, and then this Slido will still be there, so we can get back to it. If you want to ask any questions, we can do that as well. But let's wait a few more seconds to see if there are more answers, and then I will hand it over to a speaker today. All right, I think the majority, it's still wrong problem selection. And with that, I hand it over to you, Business.
Thank you, Batul. Let me start off by sharing my screen first. Tell me if you're able to see it. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Good.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Batul and Product People, for hosting me. Um, My name is Somnath Biswas. As Batul mentioned, I've been building LLM products, actually NLP products for the last 10 years, LLM products mainly for the last 3 years. And today I just wanted to kind of talk about some key decision points that I've had to make when I've been building these products, and hopefully you can find them useful in your projects as well. So let's get started. um, Obviously my experience comes from, so this is again just to kind of give you the caveat, my experience comes from the various conversational products that we've gone live with. We actually now have roughly around 8 agentic products out there, most of them conversational, some of them not so much, but we have conversational products both on the web as well as WhatsApp. um, and genuinely what we've seen is, compared to even when there is a human to human chat, compared to pure NLP intent based models and then LLM, we've seen a higher CSAT, customer satisfaction. We've seen a higher LTV, the lifetime value. In this case, we measure it based on the number of CVs or number of applications that a candidate makes. Um, and we've seen a higher performance as well. So our experiences, we've obviously had our own iterations, but our experiences have genuinely been very positive from an LLM perspective. And I'll kind of walk you through. So I'll draw on those experiences when I kind of talk about the decision points. Um, let's start off with why do it. And this is actually, so some of the benefits are very obvious compared to intent based models. When you're building conversational assistants over here, you don't have to train it. Previously you had to train it on the intent, the entities. That is no longer a problem because these are obviously pre-trained large models. Time to market goes down. Again, you're saving a lot of time in terms of training iterations around it. Customer experience is better because these are more open conversations, so people are able to express themselves. You can make them multimodal, not just in terms of text. You can have voice, you can have image. So again, the experience is a lot more richer. The build cost, mainly because of the testing and the other elements, mainly because of the training, goes down. I'll talk about testing later, but essentially the build cost kind of goes down significantly compared to others. You have the benefit of making them multilingual, and obviously wide coverage. But here's the first insight: don't build LLMs because of these benefits. You need to start off with the uh, the actually the what the survey kind of talked about is the problem statement that you're trying to solve. So for us, LLMs made sense because we are, so as Stepstone or Total Jobs, we are in the job tech space. As most of us would know, job search is fairly emotionally draining. It's a very lonely activity, and that's why we decided to go down the conversational route and bring in the LLMs so that we could actually account for the emotions involved. So that was our driver. If we had found something else that would have served the purpose, we would have gone with that. So my first insight would be that stay true to the business problem that you're trying to solve. Your thinking could be LLM first, but doesn't have to be LLM only. So think of these. The benefits are obviously there, but focus on the key benefit that you're going to gain out of it. In this case, providing a almost like a companion experience to the job seeker. Be mindful. I'm sure by now everyone is kind of aware of this, but just to call out the key risks. Um, any model, not just LLM, any model is essentially stochastic in nature. So from that perspective, there is no 100% consistency. You press a button, you will not always get the same response. It might be a variation of that. So consistency is something that you have to account for as a product manager. There is the risk of hallucination and misinformation or disinformation. This is where you need to kind of be very careful in terms of the providing it with the due information, because it has a tendency to always respond. In the absence of the due information, it will make stuff up, it will hallucinate. There is an element of bias, harmful content is there, data privacy is obviously a known concern. Operational costs are higher. Let me call this out. When it comes down to operational, while build cost is less, the operational costs are higher, mainly because there's obviously an element of testing, and also there's an element of a continuous monitoring and testing. because the job does not stop once you go live. Actually, the task starts after you go live, because you have to continuously check for model drift, you have to check for data drift. Is the performance still the same? So the operational cost is high, including something that is obviously well known is around the token costs as well. So there's additional token cost, and there is a cost of maintaining and monitoring the system continuously, more so than the others. So the operational costs are higher. Cybersecurity in terms of prompt injection, misuse is obviously there. So you have to kind of put in the due guardrails around that. Something that I think was initially a problem. Now I think the industry's anyways figured out how to kind of handle this. Actually, before the session, we were talking about the landscape is actually changing significantly, not just in terms of new models coming up, but even the architectures and paradigms. So keeping pace with that is a problem. The regulatory landscape is settling down more or less, but again, it is an evolving thing. There are many things. All of us, at least a few of us, would be in front of the EU AI Act compliance. Interpreting those, understanding those is an issue. And then obviously there is one less talked about thing, which is around the reskilling or the new skilling part of it. Not every engineer, in my experience, and these are brilliant engineers, not every engineer is actually keen on prompt engineering, nor should they be. And prompt engineering and prompt writing might require a different skill set as well. So this is a very practical risk that most of us would face when we are building the AI products. But let's get into those the 12 decision points that we were talking about. But let's take a step back just to give you my mental model. This is, in my mind, what the anatomy of a conversation is. So you start off with, where are you having the conversation? A desktop, a mobile app, WhatsApp, whatever it is. How are you having the conversation? Is it via text? Is it rich media, voice, video combination? Who are you having it with? Is it a human? Is it with an agent? Once you're having the conversation, how are the decisions taken? What is the reasoning behind it, orchestration around it, the orchestration next best action? And then what are you drawing on for these conversations, which could be, again, you can have an API base, you could basically be calling on certain tools, you're using external data sources, trained utterances, whatever it is. So this is more or less the anatomy of a conversation. Why is this relevant? Because I'll talk about another anatomy, but this is more or less the framework in which I kind of look at things. So over here, your first decision point, just echoing what I mentioned earlier, is it is LLM first, but not LLM only. So your first decision point is, where should you bring in the LLM? And if you follow the anatomy of the conversation, there are probably 3 or 4 different places where you can use it. First is obviously, once the user has presented something, intent detection. Traditionally, you would have a model which has been trained on certain intents. It recognizes those, but it might come back and say, I don't understand it. So, but you could, in the traditional model, you used to have the KNN equivalent model for intent detection. Orchestration used to be rules heuristics based, and the responses were more or less canned. And we put in a lot of effort to kind of give all sorts of answer to kind of give it variance. And this still works. It doesn't have to be always LLM. This still works if your use case is narrow, if you're not expecting too many variations, you need to kind of provide canned responses. This is still a very much an okay thing to do. But if this is not the case, you can then kind of talk about the LLM paradigm. LLMs are very good at intent detection. This is one place where I would definitely recommend the use of LLMs, because your intent detection is very strong, and then what you do with it can vary. So you could actually start off with understanding the intent, still follow a rules-based orchestration in terms of, this is what the user says, this is what my rule says, and then provide a canned response. Now, this is again utilitarian, not much of a variation, but it does the job. It's a defined flow. If that's what your use case is, go for this. If, however, you want to kind of bring in certain amount of variation, you want to kind of not make it rules based, but have it decide um, uh, based on the agent, you could have an agent orchestration, but you could still keep the responses canned. This is particularly, for instance, in my use case, when it comes down to issues like compliance related places for GDPR responses, etc., where the response has to be in a certain format, and this is like pre-approved. I still use the LLM, I'll still use the agent for orchestration, but I will still go for canned response. And finally, which is most of my use cases, would essentially be, pardon me, you have the LLM as the model, you have agent orchestration, and the model whilst it kind of gathers the information through the tools, etc., it can dynamically generate the response, which obviously keeps the experience a lot more natural, and obviously the experience improves from a user's perspective as well. So first decision is decide where you want to use the LLM. Before I go any further, let's kind of almost align in terms of when I talk about agent, what do I mean by an agent and how is it different from a chatbot? This is a question that usually kind of I guess asked as well. And the simple answer is in the name. It's basically it has an agency. So a chatbot, unlike an agent, does not have the closed loop autonomy. It does not follow a goal. It's still something that has instructions. It basically can call tools as well. It has the memory. It has policy, things that we associate the agent with, but it does not have the agency to close the loop. So essentially, and what an agent does, it has the ability to follow a goal and a policy. It takes an action. Based on the action, it looks for the response. Once it has got the response, it decides what it needs to do next. If the goal has not been met, it then takes a call on what to do next. The agency element is there. That is essentially, and this is what it does, these multi-step iteration, it does without any user intervention. So this is where a key difference between an agent and a chatbot is. So to speak, if you're looking for a formula for an agent, it's essentially you have a goal and a policy that it iterates based on. It basically will plan, it'll act, it'll observe the result, update the status, and keep iterating till the goal or the policy is met. And in order to do this, it'll use the model, it'll use the tools that are available to it, it'll use memory, obviously within the limits of the constraint or the guardrail. So this is essentially what an agent is. In terms of speaking in terms of anatomy, and again, I'm happy to kind of share these slides later on. But if you're talking about an agent, usually when people think about agent, we all talk just about the prompt, but there is a lot more to an agentic setup, right from the goal to the policy, the entire orchestration around it. And each of this would actually be a decision point, and we'll talk about these later. But this is just to kind of give you a sense, right from the agent to basically having a setup for the runtime environment, to the evaluation setup, which is usually not talked about a lot, observability, compliance, all these aspects in my mind form the anatomy of an agentic setup. With that context setting, let's go into the second part where from a product perspective, you would get involved. And this is essentially defining the prompt as well. Because prompt is all about defining it's almost like a contract with the agent that you have in terms of how it reacts. So if you think of the agent as a junior colleague, these are the instructions that you're providing, because how the agent performs is actually going to influence the user's experience, which is obviously from a product perspective we are very deeply involved in. So from a product perspective, the guidance would be to get involved in all aspects of the prompt, right from defining the goal to defining the policy. You are essentially going to give it be responsible from a context perspective. If it is using RAG, this is where you decide what kind of information it has access to so that it responds in a certain way. The guidance that you provide, examples are a very important way to guide the performance and guide the flow of the product, which is where your designers, conversational designers, other designers, US product would kind of get involved, so that you're providing the right set of static and dynamic examples for the agent to follow. Obviously, from an engineering perspective, there's an output contract in terms so that it gets used. And then this is also where a product thinking would kind of come in, or product mindset would come in terms of the trade-off decisions, should the agent face those. There's also a decision point, and we'll talk about it later, but there's also a decision point between a single agent versus a multiple agent. Because in a multiple agent, many of the aspects that are inherent, which are basically almost stored within the single agent, that is kind of taken outside, and you would have you could have the goal sit externally as a separate task object. It is not over there. So you could have an overall goal, and then you could have an agent specific goal as well. So there's a difference between a single and a multiple agent setup. But you're kind of, from a product perspective, you need to first have an opinion and have a think about what your prompt would be. So that's your second decision point. Third decision point, to an extent, you might think that this is almost like about engineering coming in, but I actually would think that this is also something that product should actually have an opinion about, is how are you generating the prompt? And there's an entire range of it. but the way you generate the prompt would influence in many aspects, right from instruction adherence. Because if you have a single large prompt, which is the very first one, and you've kind of kept it static, whatever it is, many a times instruction adherence is impacted. It generally takes the top bit, takes the bottom bit, the middle bit it kind of tends to ignore. So this is very much a product issue for you to kind of consider as well. Obviously there's an element of latency involved. Larger the prompt, the latency issue aspects come in, again non-functional but also from a product perspective important. So there are various aspects by which, so you need to kind of get involved in terms of how the prompt is getting generated, and there are many options which you can use to do this. In our case, even before this was a norm, what we did is we came up with this concept of a dynamic assembly, which is where the LLM first understands the intent, and then we had these pre-built chunks of prompts available, and based on the intent we would actually assemble the prompt on the fly so that it stays as compact and as specific to the task as possible. The size is less, instruction adherence goes up, the cost becomes less because the number of tokens is less and latency is less. So this is another aspect for you to think about in terms of how are you generating the prompt as well. Again, a related concept, nothing for us to from a nothing immediately actionable from a product perspective, but something that as a product person you need to be aware of is the prompt caching element, where once it has kind of done the first round of processing it, it actually uses the key value cache to only regenerate certain and reprocess only certain parts of the prompt. Rest of the parts of the prompt are cached. This from a product perspective is again very useful because roughly around 70 to 80% of the cost and the latency can be brought down. So something for us to be aware of, and when you're discussing with the engineering colleagues, maybe something to kind of discuss as well. Then let's talk about, once you want in terms of the agent, how should the agent actually go about the process, the action loop of thinking. Now, especially in the case of a multiple agent setup, how do you want your agents to interact with each other? And I've kind of listed down, there are multiple models over here, but I've listed down two variants. One is a supervisor model, where you would have a single agent which is actually talking to the user, so to speak. And then once it has understood the intent and the task, it then assigns tasks to the various other sub agents, and that's how it kind of gets the job done. So there is a supervisor model. The other extreme would be almost like a blackboard collaboration, where it's a federated setup and each agent is doing their job. They're basically updating in a common place, and then that's how the task gets done. But you need to, as a product person, have an opinion on this. I specifically, we've kind of gone for the supervisor model. Why? Because the thinking over here has been that you have almost like the case of microservices, you actually have these sub agents which are specialist agents, and then for each experience you have a supervisor which actually has the business logic to it. So what it does, it allows a lot of reusability that kind of gets unlocked if you kind of keep them in the microservices or specialist agent mode. But depending upon your use case, you can go with whatever makes sense for you. Equally, there are various ways. So these are not either or. So you have orchestration pattern. You need to decide on the trigger pattern as well. Most often, if people who are familiar with this, you would be aware of the React, where there is a reasoning, it acts on it, observes, and the loop follows. In the process, it will call tools. Many a times, it might also be an event trigger. So for instance, a stock goes up or down, that could be a trigger for the agent to start doing its tasks as well. So you need to decide on the orchestration pattern, you need to decide on the trigger patterns. When it comes down to the actual process of thinking, this is again, you have multiple options available. It could be something very linear in terms of you give something, it straight away gives you the response, or especially thinking from a compliance perspective, models like chain of thought become very useful, because then it kind of gives you a sense of, this is useful in the initial days of building the product as well, because then you are kind of getting a sense of why did it do what it did. So in terms of root cause analysis, etc., this is useful. But also from a compliance perspective, this is useful to have in the audit trail, where it kind of gives you the chain of thought in terms of, this is what the user has asked for, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what my output is. So again, you could basically have a linear piece. You could also have multi path, where it's almost like a tree reasoning happening. Self consistency is another aspect which I've used as well, where you kind of almost have you have multiple routes, and the most consistent answer is what you kind of pick up. Trade-off over here is there's an element of additional processing and latency that kind of comes in, but again, something for us to have an opinion on in terms of what is the approach that we're going to take. You have other approaches as well in terms of continuously self-critiquing and keeping it iterative. You could almost have some part of it driven externally as well. So there are multiple options. My intention is not to kind of tell you that this is right or wrong. I'm just here to kind of give you a sense that this is a decision point, and there are options for you that you should explore based on your specific user journey that you're trying to build this agent for. We talked about it earlier, but in terms of the trade-offs, single versus multi-agent, my simple logic over here would be that one key driver which drove was, and there are multiple drivers for kind of going for a multi-agent, and it sounds like the right thing to do. It's very sophisticated as well. But my honest suggestion is, if you're starting off on the journey, don't go in for the complexity. Start off with the simplest single. In fact, start off with a single prompt, monolithic prompt, single agent. As your user journey becomes more complex and it requires those separate functions, because every agent would have its own policy, it has its own set of tools, it has its own guidance, own guardrails. So if you get to the point where the user journey requires these separate functions to be performed, that's when you're thinking of a multi-agent setup. Also, a multi-agent setup gives you a few additional benefits. It gives you, you can almost, you're not stuck with the same model. Depending upon the task, you can choose a cheaper model, you can choose a different model. So multi-agent setup kind of gives you that benefit. Equally, one other benefit that I've recently realized, it also allows for simultaneous action. So you could just start off with a task, and simultaneously you can have three different agents, look for the information and then kind of provide you with that information. So be mindful in terms of whether you really need the multi-agent setup, and look for your reasons. And if your reasons point towards a multi-agent setup, then go for it. Otherwise, always start off with a rules-based setup if it's possible, because LLMs are costly, they are more complex. If the rules-based setup is not there, start off with the simplest version of the LLM. Another aspect to kind of talk about, I think I was kind of mentioning this earlier as well, is one of the big aspects of a agent is that it can actually do stuff. And how does it act? It's not just a conversation, it gets things done for you. And how does it get it done? Is basically through the use of tools. So it kind of looks at the request, it checks, do I have all the information in my memory? No. Okay, I'm going to basically make a call to a tool. And so tool calling is important, but there are certain trade-offs over here as well. And this is probably true for tools and probably also true for skills as well. And the big thing to call out is how well are the tools and the skills defined, because ultimately it is going to be an agent that is going to decide which tool to use. And if you have a situation where there is an overlap between the tools, you might actually have the agent end up calling the wrong tool. And then depending upon how critical the task is and what is the risk involved, you might actually end up with an unfavorable result. So be mindful of the risk factor of the task. This is essentially one of the major aspects to do, because ultimately as product people, we are meant to deliver the outcome. So be responsible, mindful of the risk involved. And if you are going down the tool route, then be mindful of how well are the tools defined. Then you can basically have other decision points in terms of, do you have a single tool called, or you have multiple tools getting called in sequence. Synchronous, asynchronous is what I was basically talking about. You could actually have these tasks also happen in parallel. You could give the model a free rein to basically call the tools, or you could keep it rules driven. But there are again pros and cons around it. Another con to kind of call out is, obviously, because you're doing more, there is going to be latency, there's going to be an additional cost, but you're getting the task done as well. So again, a number of aspects are detailed out. In the interest of time, I'm conscious of the time. Let me move on. This is another This actually might seem like almost like a technical decision, but in my mind, it emerges from the product experience that you're trying to provide. So you could have, so for instance, let me talk about an experience. So the very first iteration of an agent that we put in, the user used to kind of come in and give the preferences in terms of the, this is the job title, location, salary, etc. And if we did not have the episodic memory, which is what we kind of brought in next, the next day the user would come in and they would have to again give that same information. But with episodic memory, what you do is you decide that based on this conversation, these are the elements that I'm going to pick out and save so that they remain available for the next iteration. So this is where you need to kind of you need to be guided by the experience that you're providing. Another example would be you might have certain key core instructions that never change. Maybe that's a good idea to then include them in the core prompt or include them, fine tune it in the model as well, because then the cost, the tokens, etc., also goes down. But if you have some information which is almost always needed, but is of a dynamic nature, this is where you kind of go for a rack setup. You could go for a rack setup. So it's long-term memory, but mutable in nature. So depending upon what is the experience that you need to kind of provide to your users, you need to decide on the memory setup as well. And this is where you partner with engineering for this. And by the way, to call out, you could actually have a combination of all these as well. But again, be driven by the need. And then this is a decision point that you'll have to make. Um, this, in terms of designing the flow of the conversation, has always been a product territory or a design territory, in terms of, because this is where you're designing the experience for the user. But traditionally what you would have is you would essentially almost define and draw the flow. And this is where my conversation design colleagues, they've had to kind of almost evolve, and they've gone from designing the flow to still designing the flow, but in a different way. And this is what I referred to earlier. You could actually have the instructions in the prompt. Most important, you could actually have them in the few short examples that you're providing, both static as well as dynamic. You could keep it rules driven. You could tweak the temperature so that you're almost giving it that leeway in terms of flexibility, in terms of the flow as well. This is where you define your base instructions, personas, and then obviously based on the feedback, there's obviously a loop back where you can keep defining your design. But so we still design the flow, but we don't really kind of almost draw it out. We influence it through the examples and through the instructions, but you're still designing and you're still responsible for the flow and the experience that the user goes through. An obvious question that comes up in terms of which model to choose, and this is not in my mind, I'm not thinking in terms of whether you should go for a Sonnet model or a GPT-4o mini or whatever it is. These are mostly the categories of the models. My guidance would be, if you're starting off, don't go get into the hassle of a fine-tuned model or a model of your own. Pick up an off-the-shelf foundational model, try it out, get to the point of product market fit. Once you have proven it, then you can get into using a smaller model. We've used, there have been cases where we've gone down, we've taken a large model and distilled it down to a smaller model, which is more specific. The cost is less, it is a lot faster as well. But that is not the first starting point. The first starting point is go with the simplest off the shelf model. That would be my guidance. Prove product market fit or get to ratification of the pain point, and then go down to the additional complexity. It is also a function of the data science capability that exists within the organization. Most of the time, you may not have the capability for the fine tuning initially. If you're just incubating AI practice within the organization, very okay to kind of start off with these models, have the prompts written down, and then you kind of almost build the pure data science capability around it. Function of time to market as well, in terms of ability to train the models. The cost involved is different as well. When you're choosing the model, check for the size of the model, for the complexity part of it. Accuracy, cost is a big factor as well. But here's my two bits of insight on this slide. One is, as I talked about earlier, a multi-agent setup allows you to kind of almost experiment with different models. So that's obviously a positive. But the second bit of call out is, when we think of agents, and I've seen this with my colleagues as well, when you think agents and we talk models, most of them are thinking LLMs. That is not necessarily always true. You could, if you're talking about on-device applications. You could have an SLM as well. You could very well have the classical models as well. And now going forward, when you talk about the physical AI part of it, you could have computer vision models, you could have word models, audio models as well. So not all of them have to be LLMs, but nevertheless, this is something for you to kind of think about. Um, this is something which I alluded to earlier and is actually never talked about. But in my mind, the biggest risk and the most important thing for any enterprise to have, and that's actually having a proper evaluation setup. Also, this might actually turn out to be costlier than you might have initially anticipated, because there is, as I said, the LLMs are stochastic in nature. So essentially, even if kind of you run the test and 9 out of 10 times it says the color red, there is no guarantee that the 10th time it will not say blue. So you need to kind of have a decent amount of tests run and have a genuine sense of the threshold and be comfortable and have the sign-offs on the necessary thresholds for those parameters. So an evaluation framework is essential. You would have various elements of it, right from the unit test to single turn test to being able to test end-to-end scenarios. You can do this manually initially, and now we've kind of fallen back on synthetic users and LLMs as judges. You should have a regression test as well, because as we all know, even if you change one aspect in the prompt, it's not just that aspect might change, it might something else might change elsewhere as well. So regression is very much a big risk. And then you should have the setup of sign-offs in terms of user acceptance testing. And then, as I mentioned, just because you've gone live with a certain parameter or certain threshold doesn't mean that the threshold will remain the same. The model drift might happen, the data drift might happen. So you need a continuous setup as well. So when you're kind of, you need to have this different layers of the evaluation setup, and you're checking for multiple things. You're checking for the core functional aspects of it. Does it do the outcome? How many times has it met the criteria? Yes or no? um, the the quality of the conversation, as well as the non-functionals in terms of latency and other aspects around it. Safety and security in terms of the core privacy elements of it. Is it following the guardrails? How many times does it actually disregard the guardrails? So you need to kind of have these tests as well. I don't know whether I talk about it, but LLMs traces as well in terms of, is it calling the right set of tools, etc. That's also a functional aspect, but that's again something to call out. Compliance aspects need to be checked. The behavioral aspects in terms of, is there intent stability? Is there help from how much does it adhere? So you've given it the persona, but how much does it adhere to the persona? All these aspects you could use. There are many tools out there, or I don't know if there are many tools. One of the tools is essentially the screenshots are from one particular tool, but you are kind of checking for hallucination and tools as well. And then once you have the report, allow for the time for iterations, because your first iteration may not get you there. So allow to run these tests, allow for the iteration, and know that it will not be perfect. And essentially, you would have to tweak, change the prompts, break them down to kind of get to those pieces. But this is something that you need to kind of be aware of pre go live. Have the regression framework in place, and then have the continuous monitoring as well as in place. And the final decision is probably one which is most important, and probably every PM's favorite, is around the key metrics. I could have very well started off with this slide as well, but you need to be very mindful of the metrics, because going back to the very first point, you are there to solve a business problem. You're not there to build an LLM product. Your product is meant to solve a problem. And so you need to start off, predefine your North Star metrics. Um, and then in the metrics, you would obviously have a few metrics from a pure AI perspective as well, along with the other performance metrics of the product. So you could very well have a funnel performance, user satisfaction, what I called out earlier, a lifetime value. These could be other things. Cost per task, cost per conversation is another aspect, given the cost of the LLMs. But you could have performance metrics around the containment ratios, the latency, hallucination rate, how grounded is it in terms of its responses. So there are multiple other aspects, bias, toxicity. So just to kind of share the insight, in our day to day, on a daily basis, we actually have a setup where we have LLMs as judges check on a regular basis for hallucination, bias, toxicity, GDPR compliance, underage. So they go through 100% of the transcripts, and then it's reviewed by the analysts. But these are parameters that you need to kind of keep track of even after it's gone live, because as I said, it might deteriorate. So again, this is another decision point, something that a PM should have an opinion on and form their thoughts on before actually you start off with building the agent. Um, Not to overstress the point, but this is, as I said, in my mind, the job of the PM actually starts off after the product goes live. So in life management is essentially critical, right from what I talked about in terms of, so we also do this real time monitoring in terms of we are using an OpenAI or a Microsoft endpoint to check for toxicity and to check for other aspects. So there is real time monitoring that is happening. There's an offline transcripts reviews. You're checking for your data points. You have things like Langfuse where you're checking for the performance observability, and is the LLM, you're looking at the LLM traces to check if the right tools are being called or not. You will have the regression process in place, and then depending upon the performance of the key needles that we talked about, you will obviously iterate and improve, and then from time to time you will have the ability to, I should have called this out. Actually, when we started off, we built it in such a way that we have the ability to swap out models. um, Not entirely a seamless thing, because many times you will have to tweak the prompts a little, but you should still have the ability to swap out models given the range of models that are available as well. So once you have this capability, depending upon if some model is cheaper, you will bring out you'll start using a different model, and then obviously you will have to go through the entire evaluation setup. So these are again certain things to keep in mind, or at least these are things that we've been doing. I'm sure there are many, but these are some of the things that we've been doing in our production setup for the agentic experiences that we've had. Just my final slide in terms of crystal ball, potential future. I hope we'll see a lot more multilingual experiences, because I think research indicates that the stickiness of the user goes up if you are speaking to them in the language of their choice. So multilingual is now a capability and should be used aggressively by the PMs post discovery, of course. Multimodal is obviously always richer, so we'll hopefully see a lot more of that. For sure, governance, explainability, evaluation, these will become almost a norm. With the advent of physical AI and the small language models, edge AI use cases, even for mobile applications, devices, robotics will become important. Um, Accounting for emotions is, in my mind, was one of my biggest driver for LMs as PMs, and I've been kind of building products for decades now. Many a times you are almost sidestepping the emotion. You're not worried about the emotion of the user. Now with the LLMs and now with conversation, you can actually account for and include the emotion in the product. This, in my mind, is a big benefit from a product perspective. And then I'm hoping, once we have the front end conversational agents, going forward, we will actually start seeing the business process workflow agents as well, with them working in the background, data agents, etc. around it. But yeah, that's essentially my last slide. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Or if you're looking for the slides, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I would be happy to have a chat or share the slides with you. But yeah, that's essentially, those were the thoughts that I wanted to share. Batul,
Yeah.
back to you.
Thank you so much, Somnath. I'll share my screen again for Slido link. We have a few questions, so thank you for listening, and thank you so much for giving a wonderful speech and also guiding us through each of the steps, and also what are the caveats that we should be aware of generally while creating LLMs, and generally while using AI as well. I think those are pretty relevant there as well. So the first question that I see here is, how do you decide how much autonomy an agent should have before introducing human approval steps?
I think it depends upon the risk of the business process. I'm not in favor of the say it's so. Let's parse this question. So when you talk about the human approval, inherent aspect over there is there's a cost element to it, right?
Hmm.
And also there's an element of the hours of service that can provide. So if you, unless you're thinking of a 24 by 7 human fallback, it's going to
Mhm.
be a fairly costly setup to have the human fallback over there. That's a separate question from the autonomy. So I would say start off with the lowest autonomy, see how it is performing. And in terms of fallbacks, if you have a human fallback or have an offline fallback, because a human autonomy
Mhm.
or a human fallback is expensive as well. So as a product person, you are kind of looking at your cost to serve. That is one of your parameters. So think about those aspects, but start off, if you're starting off with a model with an agentic setup, look at the inherent risk of it. If it is to do with compliance, if it is to do with issuing refunds, do not go down the high autonomy route because you will probably end up burning your fingers with that. So start off with the simplest aspect, and then depending upon how it is performing, gradually then you can let it do take the decisions. Otherwise, in most cases, have a fallback or be rules driven around it. So I think it's like, again, it's horses for courses, but keep the
Mhm.
cost in mind.
All right. The second question that came in is, what was some hidden operational challenges you faced after deploying agents internally or to customers?
So some of the challenges we continue to face. So one was obviously, for instance, there's an element of latency, and initially it was not just latency at our end. There was latency at, because these were the initial stages, so there was latency at the users, at the model providers end as well. And that's why one of the first models that we started off with was on WhatsApp, because WhatsApp kind of was asynchronous in nature, and at that point of time, latencies were quite high. So latency was one aspect. The cost is another aspect to it. We were very conscious of hallucination, bias, toxicity to start off with. We were probably over conscious about things like prompt injection. But I can give you, so maybe this is another surprise that kind of came to us. We did not see any prompt injection, but we actually saw people misusing the agent for other purpose. So this is a job agent, but they could actually use it to kind of write a report on something else. So they are kind of eating up your tokens. This is where
Mhm.
you kind of almost have to then basically tighten your guardrails around it. So there were some learnings in terms of how people use it. There were some learnings around the basic latency around it, but I think we were very diligent, or at least we tried to be as diligent as possible around the core risks of hallucination. We had an excellent team of analysts as well who kind of went through it. So hallucination, bias, toxicity aspects we were not worried about. Cost of testing was a revelation for me. I hadn't accounted for that, but at least the very first iteration, there's going to be a fairly high cost of testing. That was a surprise. But because of the setup that we had, I don't think we have faced any other core surprises, or nothing comes to mind at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one question on parts opinion. So, what parts of an agent should ideally remain deterministic instead of LLM driven?
Uh, so I think you're talking about the orchestration part of it. And again, as I said, um, I would prefer a deterministic flow any day if your journey allows for it,
Mhm.
because it's less hassle. Um, if it's a straightforward piece, if their options aren't too many, you don't have to give the user too many aspects to basically too many routes to follow. It's a very single linear user journey. Fall back on a rules based engine, or if it requires from a compliance perspective that it needs to follow a certain pattern, go down the deterministic route. So I would say start off, see why you need a non-deterministic, an agent-driven orchestration flow first. If there's good enough reason, then go down this route because you are adding complexity to it. Um,
Mm.
Third insight I would like to call out is also, um, if you have too many models in the process, and if you think of the accuracy ratio, so let me just say, hey, one model has an accuracy of zero point 0.9, right? You bring in another model, it's does not remain zero point 0.9, it's zero point 0.9 into zero point 0.9, so suddenly it's gone down to 0.81. You bring in another model, it goes down. So be conscious of the number of times you're bringing a model into the user journey, and if it is something that is quite critical, you have to account for that accuracy going down and the probabilistic element kind of going down as well. So keep this in mind. Wherever you have a chance, go down the heuristics route. If there is a good enough reason or some aspects of it, then go down the orchestration flow, the agent driven orchestration.
Thank you. We're going to take three more questions because I think we're running short on time, but there are a lot more. So what we can do is we can send you the questions afterwards. But right now, let's cover the three first come first serve questions. Then tool what role does tool design play in agent reliability compared to prompt quality itself?
I think it's the aspect of a tool. See, ultimately, I think whether you're kind of making use of tools or whether you're making use of skills, um, I would basically always fall back on that instead of having everything in the prompt. One, there's a general element of reusability. You build it once, you test it once, you don't have to keep testing it again. And it kind of gives you that much, it keeps it modular as well. So if the question is a choice between tools versus having the instructions within the prompt, many times within the prompt also you might not be able to do it because you're calling an external API. But it is always a good idea to have separate tools or skills in terms of core capabilities that you might reuse, um, that you might kind of reuse on a regular basis. But maybe I'll take the moment to kind of clarify one other aspect because there's a confusion between tools and skills and sub agents. So essentially, think of it as a tool being able to an external capability to perform a task. A skill has that additional element of instructions and policy around the tool, and then the moment you kind of give it the autonomy or the agency, then it becomes a sub agent. So depending upon your specific need, you can decide to use a tool, a skill, or a sub agent. But any day, always a good idea to have a plethora of a library of tools, a library of skills, a library of sub agents, because reusability is there. So reusability obviously impacts from a time to market perspective, but also your testing cost goes down.
Mhm. Okay. How do you, okay. So this is, do you think RAG is being overused today as a substitute for proper memory design?
Quite likely. Quite likely. As I said, I think it is many times. I mean, again, can't say a generic statement in terms of is it being overused or not, but I think there's a lot of excitement about track. There's a lot of excitement about LLMs as well. So it is quite likely. The only guidance at this stage is be very clear of why you need to use it. If you can do without it, go for the simpler, the cheaper option, because it's not
Mhm.
just the cost of build, it's also the cost of maintenance. But in many cases you might need RAG. So for instance, if there is a policy document, there's a customer refund policy document that is getting used many a times, and more importantly keeps changing as well. You cannot have it in the prompt. You will have to have it as a separate document that gets referenced, because that keeps it then modular around it. So I was recently kind of talking to a colleague of mine who works in a law firm, and they're kind of building it. So they have almost like a playbook in terms of which contract to use or not. The playbook keeps changing, so you cannot have it in the prompt. Over there you will have to go for a RAG
Mhm.
solution. So again, be driven by the need, be driven by the constraints, and if the answer is a RAG, so be it.
Thank you. One last question. How do you evaluate to achieve even a consistent test output in a multi-agent context?
Repeat the question. Sorry.
How do you evaluate to achieve even a consistent test output in a multi-agent context?
So again, depends upon, so any kind of evaluation setup. If this was a multi-agent setup, the way you would do it is you're obviously, if you remember that stack that I'm talking about, that I talked about, you would actually have your specific tests for the particular agents as well. So these are individual components, but ultimately purely from a product perspective, what I'm looking at is the experience that the user goes through. So my biggest, so whilst I'll look at, cost and instruction adherence and latency and other aspects, and is each of the agents performing well or not. But if they are woven into a user journey, I'm looking at the overall key metrics for that user journey in terms of the funnel, the performance, the overall experience. So my approaches, and this might be one way of going about it, is almost you are kind of testing it from a user's perspective in terms of is the agent able to kind of finish the core goal of that particular journey, whether it's a single agent or multi-agent, doesn't matter. um, is there a naturalness, is the cost of conversation good enough, is the latency is there, and then you're kind of going into the individual aspects of, is the right agent getting called or not. But these are kind of your indicative metrics, and if there's anything wrong in them, then you're kind of going into, is the multi-agent, is one particular agent being called or not. You are also treating each of these agents just the way you would treat them as any of the microservices. You're also testing and treating each of these agents. But from a product go no go perspective, I'm looking at the overall experience of the product, and then that's how I decide. I don't know if that answers the question.
All right. Thank you so much, Somnath. I will take over from here in terms of wrapping up by quickly talking about a little bit about product people. We do still have a few questions. We'll send them to you. You can either answer them on LinkedIn or if, yeah.
Offline. Yeah.
So that should work. Let's talk a little bit about product people, the use cases we cover. We do interim and fractional support for product manager or product leader. Permanent position covers. For example, it takes 3 to 9 months to hire for this role, and that's where we come in. We also come in for parental leave coverage, or if there are important and urgent initiatives where we want to accelerate product discovery and delivery, we cover those as well. We also do product coach, program manager, and product ops. So if there are needs to run development plans, improve performance cycles, or for hyper growth or at scale, 0 to 1 projects, we also do that. We are also experts at product discovery, so discover the next big thing. So, like from use cases to the jobs to be done model, etc. We also cover those, and we also do a low no code pilot MVP and something that can get started immediately, and we can help accelerate. These are some of our B2C clients, which include eBay, Scout24, FreeNow, etc. And these are some of our B2B clients, which range from World Health Organization to remote. Some of the stats. So we have supported 690 plus cross-functional teams, 130 plus clients from startup to scale-ups, and publicly listed companies. We have 40 product managers, including product leaders, and all of us are in-house. We have 50%, 59% women in the team, and 60% in the leadership. So we promote skills before CV, and that's how our recruitment process is. All right. Finally, thank you so much for listening in, and thank you so much for having this very informative session with us. And if you have any questions, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to share via Slido. We will also send all of the questions to Somnath as well. Finally, we're hiring, and you can scan this link to get more details on it. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which goes out once a month, and we talk about more product ideas. And we occasionally also follow the TV series everybody's following these days. All right, then I think that's it. Thank you
Thank you.
so much, everybody.